In the late 1970s and early 1980s, video games were exploding in the arcades and starting to make their way into homes. But if you wanted to take that experience with you, your options were pretty limited. You had electronic games like Simon and electronic football. Then you had electromechanical handhelds like the Tomy Blip games and Tomy Digital Derby. And then came the LCD games such as the Nintendo Game & Watch and then later on the Tiger Electronic handhelds. They were all fun and addictive, but they had one thing in common. They were all just dedicated systems. If you wanted to play a different game, you had to buy another system. But there was a bigger idea out there, a dream really. What if you could take multiple games with you? What if your handheld wasn't just a toy, but a system? Something with interchangeable cartridges and its own screen. A true portable video game console. This is the story of the handheld video game consoles that came before the Nintendo Game Boy. The experiments, the oddities, and the forgotten machines that laid the groundwork for everything that came next. The story of the Microvision starts in the mid-1970s. Jay Smith and his firm Smith Engineering wanted to get into the evolving video game market. This is the same Jay Smith that later developed the Vectrex. But instead of creating another home game console, he wanted to make portable games. The first game that Smith helped create was Mattel's Electronic Football. This game became an instant hit for Mattel, which got the attention of Milton Bradley. In 1978, Milton Bradley released the Ralph Baer designed Simon game, which was a huge success. After Simon's success, they wanted to get into the portable handheld market. They saw the success Smith had with the electronic football game and asked Smith Engineering to design a portable game console. Smith got to work on the project. He wanted to create a true portable game console with interchangeable game cartridges, just like the home consoles had. Due to the challenges that this brought, no company had attempted it yet. However, the biggest issue was screen technology at the time. Really, only two types of displays were available: vacuum fluorescent or LCD. LCD technology was still relatively new, and the biggest producer of LCD screens at the time was Hughes Aircraft. Earlier in the 1970s, Smith Engineering had started to supply Hughes with the chemical needed to make the screens. With their experience in the manufacturing process, Smith started to design their own screen for the new portable. The finished screen would be 16 by 16 pixels, being able to use all 16 in a row, unheard of at the time. Up to this point, only 3 rows could be used at once. After the screen was designed, the cartridge was next. The best way for them to do it at the time was to put the CPU inside the cartridge, because each game would be different. It would keep cost of the unit down and make it simple to design around. The actual unit only had the screen, the LCD driver circuitry, the controls, and the power components. The rest would be handled by the individual cartridges. Once the prototype was finished, they presented it to Milton Bradley, but the design was denied. It was about the size of the original Game Boy, but Milton Bradley wanted the console to be bigger, because apparently Americans like things bigger. So they redesigned the case to be bigger and more elongated. They went back to Milton Bradley, and at this time it was approved for production. After the approval, Smith got to work making games for the console. The first games which were ready by the Microvision's release were Blockbuster, Bowling, Connect 4, and Pinball. It was also around this time that there were issues obtaining the CPU, the Intel 8021 processor. With the shortages, Smith knew they could not produce enough units. So they switched over to the Texas Instruments TMS 1100. The unit had advantages and disadvantages. On the plus side, it took less voltage to power the TMS 1100, but the CPU was less powerful, and all the games had to be reprogrammed for the new processor. The Microvision was released in November of 1979 in the US, Canada, and Europe. It was a huge success for them at first, selling enough units to garner $8 million in profit in its first year of sales. By the end of 1979, 3 more games were released: Mindbuster, Star Trek Phaser Strike, and Vegas Slots. With his perceived success, Smith Engineering invested a lot of money into designing the next Microvision to replace the current one. The new console would have an unheard of 32 by 32 pixel backlit screen and have a CPU based inside the unit. But right about this time, things started to change for the Microvision. Many of the units were failing due to the screen turning completely black, known as screen rot. The manufacturing process for the screens was not the best of quality. The screens may have been contaminated during the manufacturing process, in between the layers of the LCD. This is what causes screen rot. Many of the units were being warrantied, and was starting to cost Milton Bradley money. Then other issues started to pop up. The cartridges, which housed the CPUs, were very sensitive to static electricity. Just touching the contacts could result in the game frying. Word started to get out about the quality issues, and sales started to slump. In 1980 and 81, there were 4 more games made for the system: Baseball, Sea Duel, Alien Raiders, and Cosmic Hunter. These were the last games to be released in the US or Canada. Sometime in 1981, Smith showed Milton Bradley the new improved version of the system they had been working on, but Milton Bradley nixed it right away. This was because of the issues that the current Microvision was having, and then they were starting to get infringement lawsuits over some of the games that were being made for the system. At this point, Milton Bradley was done. They discontinued the Microvision in 1981, and there was one more game released in 1982 in Europe, Super Blockbuster. The Microvision had a 2-year lifespan, from 1979 until 1981. It sold about 200,000 units and was the first portable handheld console with interchangeable cartridges, and was the inspiration for the future Nintendo Game Boy. The year is 1981, and the idea of interchangeable cartridges in a handheld has been out there for a while now with the Microvision. Other companies were paying close attention to this, and one of those companies was Entex. Enter the Entex Select-A-Game. You can picture somebody at Entex that looks at the Milton Bradley Microvision and said, "Alright, well, this is a solid idea, but I think we can do this differently, and more importantly, we can do this on the cheap." And basically that's what this thing was. It wasn't a reinvention or a clone, but a reinterpretation of the same idea. Now, it doesn't have an LCD. Instead, it has a VFD, or vacuum fluorescent display. And if you never saw one in person, it has this certain glow to it. The bright reds, the soothing blues. But compared to the Microvision, it felt alive. It just popped in a way that early LCD screens just couldn't do. But once you get past the flashy display, you start to realize something pretty quick. Under the hood, it's basically the same trick as the Microvision. There was no CPU inside of the base unit, so everything, the processor, the ROM, everything was inside of the cartridge. So once again, just like the Microvision, the game cartridge itself is really the console, and the console is just a piece of plastic that has the controls on it, which was a fascinating idea. And then you have the design of this thing. So it was supposed to be a handheld, but it felt a lot more like a tabletop. I mean, this thing was bulky, because if you had to hold this thing in your hands, yeah, you're gonna get real sore real quick. This isn't something you would put in your back pocket. This is something you would put in your backpack. Now, the library was already small to begin with. We're talking about 6 games, and that's it. And one of them was very familiar looking, and yeah, that didn't go unnoticed. Now, Coleco at the time had the licensing rights to Pac-Man for handhelds. And what do you think happened next? Lawyers got involved, the courts got involved, and the game got pulled off the market. And suddenly, their little tiny library even got smaller. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, it's not hard to see why this thing struggled. It was big, it was bulky, it was limited, and by 1981, it felt like it was chasing something that it just couldn't catch up to. And it just didn't have enough push forward with the idea. And this is where the Select-A-Game becomes really interesting, because it's not quite a handheld, not quite a console, not quite an evolution, and not quite good enough to succeed in the market. It was just an experiment that never fully figured out what it wanted to be. So let's go into 1982, when handheld portable systems were really starting to show their way into the market. One came out that was truly weird. It was called the Entex Adventure Vision. Now, when you first lay eyes on this thing, you don't think it's a handheld, and you don't think it's a home console. It looks really like a mini arcade cabinet, something like you'd see sitting in the corner of a pizza place in the early 1980s. And this is where things go from being weird to being weirder. because the Adventure Vision doesn't have a normal screen per se. There's no LCD, no CRT, no vacuum fluorescent display, nothing like that. Instead, it uses a spinning mirror and a vertical strip of LEDs, and that's it. So here's how it works. Inside the unit, there's a motor spinning a mirror at high speed. Next to it, you've got a single row, or column actually, of red LEDs. As the mirror spins, it reflects the column across your field of view, over and over and over and over and over again, so fast that your brain stitches it all together as one full image. This is pretty much the same technology that Nintendo used in the Virtual Boy about a decade later. Now, under the hood of this thing, it was powered by the Intel 8048 processor, something you'd find in a lot of early electronics at the time. And the resolution, it was roughly, I think 150 by 40. At least that's what your eyes thought you were seeing, but like I said, technically, it was just a line of LEDs being flung across space pretty much. Okay, so here's the catch. Well, actually several catches. First of all, there's a motor inside this thing, and that means noise. A constant mechanical hum when you're playing. And secondly, this thing chews through power and just eats batteries alive. And then there was the big one. That mirror system, if it failed, that was it. You had absolutely no picture, no image, and you couldn't play the game anymore. Reliability of this console was really in question. And even if everything worked perfectly, you didn't have a lot to play with because the entire library is only 4 games. That's it. Just 4. So if you've never heard of this system, numbers don't lie. Estimates suggest that around 10,000 units were ever made, and who knows how many were actually sold. This thing barely existed. And that's what makes the Adventure Vision so fascinating. Because really this thing crosses the line between genius and over-engineering, in a way like no other system does. It's not just different, it's boldly different, and maybe just a little too far ahead of where the technology and the market were ready to go at the time. Let's take a trip to 1984. Now this is a time right after the great American video game crash in 1983 and how it just tore through the video game industry. Companies were folding, retailers were pulling back, and consumers, well, they lost confidence in the video game market. And right in the middle of all that chaos, one company stepped up that you probably never heard of, Palmtex, and they released the Super Micro. And somehow, they chose the absolute worst time in video game history to release a new handheld console. But this is where the story starts to get interesting, because if you look at just the hardware, the cartridges included a 32 by 16 LCD display, and the screen itself was backlit. Also, they had the CPU and the RAM and ROM on the cartridge itself. So this thing looked really good on paper, so why didn't it succeed? Well, there's a few reasons for that. The first reason being that it only had 3 games in the entire library, and that was it. And basically that wasn't enough to gain consumer confidence on launch. And obviously there was no other titles launched afterwards because this console was shortly lived. Now the second reason would be the build quality of this thing. So when you held it in your hands, it just felt like a cheap toy. It would creak and it would crank and it would do everything when you're hitting all the buttons, and it just felt really cheap in your hands. And that's to be, understandable, seeing that most of the electronics were inside the cartridge itself, while the base unit was really just the controller. Now on top of all this, there was only 5,000 of these units ever made, so it makes this one of the most rare retro gaming consoles ever made. And if you're a retro collector and you got one of these, you're definitely one of the fortunate ones, because these things go for a ton of money now if you can get your hands on one. But really, timing mattered, and the Palmtex showed up at the exact moment that the industry wasn't ready to believe in anything new. So instead of being remembered as a stepping stone, it just kind of disappeared from history, lost in the aftermath of a market that had already collapsed. Now we head to 1984 Japan, because while North America was still recovering from the video game crash, innovation didn't stop everywhere. It was actually growing. So enter the Epoch Game Pocket Computer. Now, Epoch wasn't some unknown startup company. I mean, they were the Epoch company, a company that already had its skin in the game. They were behind systems like the Epoch Cassette Vision and Super Cassette Vision, which in Japan actually found a decent level of success. And beyond that, they were deeply rooted in the portable electronic toys, such as baseball and football and other electronic portable devices. So this wasn't their first attempt at something like this. They had experience and they understood the market space, and you can feel that the second you look at the system. Because compared to everything else that we talked about so far, this feels different. The design was better and the layout makes more sense, and the idea of a handheld console really starts to feel cohesive. And yet, it's still not quite there. And that's because of the game library, with 5 titles. Better than some of the earlier cartridge-based portable systems, but still nowhere near enough to build real momentum for the product or a consumer baseline. So why does the Game Pocket computer matter? Well, by 1984, you can start to see the pieces starting to line up. Cartridges are no longer a novelty, they're basically expected. And portable screens, they were improving, and game design was evolving. Controls were getting closer to what players actually wanted. And that's why this moment in time is so interesting, because it feels like a pause, like everything's about to click, but it hasn't quite yet. And this is the calm before the storm, because in just a few years, everything is about to change.